recognizing, whoa, but if we go just too far there, he's literally going to destroy the entire country. So what you get is a bunch of made up rules that literally is not based on precedent. It makes no sense at all. The Supreme Court makes the most awful rulings, Harry, but they do also recognize that Trump is a complete madman. So there's this tension between them wanting to just be the most horrible right-wing court imaginable.
Facing Trump's demands and the rising threats against them, the Supreme Court just took an unprecedented step. Is this a sign of fear or a desperate tactic? Stick around because the truth will shock you. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video.
And so there was a lawsuit that was filed by two individuals. One was Gwen Wilcox, who was from the National Labor Relations Board. The other is Kathy Harris from the Merit Systems Protection Board. Was the ruling they made this past week, where they basically gave Donald Trump a blank check or full permission to what we always thought would be unlawful, to fire any chairperson or committee person on these independent agencies. We always viewed that if you wanted to fire people like that, it's got to be for cause, not just for any reason. Trump fired them just because, not for cause.
What happens when a guy who once dubbed himself the chosen one decides judges are standing in his way? Simple. He throws tantrums louder than a toddler missing snack time, and chaos follows close behind. Donald Trump, the self-proclaimed king of nicknames and grudges, has taken his campaign of intimidation up a notch, turning judges into his newest targets. Public criticism? Check. Rallies egging on his supporters to demand removals? Double check. And of course, let's not forget a full-throttle smear effort from his cheerleaders like Elon Musk and even Laura Loomer, whose Twitter habits make teenagers look restrained. But here's the kicker. It's not just name-calling or angry rants anymore. It's dangerous. Reuters unearthed over 600 chilling social media posts specifically calling for violence against judges and even their families. Think about that. Threats so bad they've required intervention from law enforcement just to keep judges safe in their own communities. One judge received multiple threats after a Trump supporter leaked their personal address, sparking outrage online. Suddenly, a legal career comes with the risk your kid's safety could be compromised because someone didn't like your ruling. And if you think that's alarming, hold on to your gavel. It gets worse. Bomb threats? Yes, actual bomb threats have been reported targeting courthouses where Trump's legal troubles are unfolding. Judicial robes might as well come with bulletproof vests nowadays. Judges now face the terrifying reality that rulings against Trump, or even perceived rulings against his side, can trigger mass calls for retaliation online, often promoted by prominent figures with millions of followers. Take Elon Musk, for example, who's been accused of stoking conspiracy flames against the judiciary before.
Like, that's the natural, logical step. There's really nothing different between the way the Federal Reserve is set up and, say, the National Labor Relations Board or the Merit Systems Protections Board. And the Supreme Court basically ruled in the shadow docket, you can do that, you can do that. But then they had to confront another issue. Well, if you can do that, then aren't you giving Donald Trump permission to fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve?
And let's not overlook Loomer, a professional troll who treats social media harassment like it's an Olympic sport. These guys aren't playing around, they're weaponizing influence. Feeling secure yet? Neither are the judges. The U.S. Marshal Service has had to level up its protection plans, providing more security details, monitoring increased threats, and working overtime to predict where the next problem will arise. Even the Judicial Conference, which typically deals with less dramatic matters like court budget allocations, now pleads for more funding from Congress just to keep these protections operational. The core of America's legal system is literally asking for extra cash to avoid chaos. That feels a lot less like bureaucracy and a whole lot more like a desperate SOS. What's even wilder is the absolute silence you'd typically expect from the Supreme Court. Historically, justices keep their heads down, staying far away from political drama. But now, even they're speaking out, sort of. Chief Justice John Roberts, who spent most of his tenure bending over backward to keep the court above the fray, recently broke his usual calm demeanor to condemn these attacks. Then there's Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who has made it clear that such intimidation tactics aren't just just an inconvenience. They're a direct attack on democracy itself. Her words weren't pulled from some vague legal speech. They were a very pointed warning about how threats like these destabilize basic democratic norms. So why is this happening now? That's the million-dollar question. Trump's legal challenges, his knack for chaos, and his loyal fan base are nothing new. What's changed is the intensity and the fallout. It's not just random extremists either. The people amplifying this harassment are calculated about it, driving the message farther than one individual ever could on their own. These online campaigns don't just intimidate judges, they create an environment where the safety of the judiciary itself is up in the air. And this leads us to the Supreme Court's breaking its own tradition of silence. Public statements like Roberts and Jackson's are one thing, but what's just as intriguing is what's happening behind closed doors. How does the highest court in the land quietly respond when their independence is being bulldozed? Rumors are swirling about internal discussions on measures aimed at protecting themselves, both physically and institutionally. If you thought metal detectors and enhanced security protocols were just for high-profile government buildings, you'd be wrong. Reports suggest there are already heightened measures being considered after consultation with multiple federal agencies. What does this level of harassment and scrambling tell us? It's simple. If the Supreme Court is talking, let alone acting, something catastrophic is brewing. Normally, they'd prefer the public forget they're human beings behind the black robes. But now they're forced to speak out, marking a major shift in how the bench interacts with public life. Why? Because they understand this isn't just a matter of keeping themselves safe. It's about maintaining the rule of law itself. When threats escalate this dramatically, you're no longer debating case law or precedent. You're watching the foundations of justice being chipped away one tweet, one threat, and one doxing attempt at a time. But let's not lose focus here. The real question isn't why they're speaking out, it's what they're doing. Clearly, public condemnation is only part of the story. So what steps is the court taking behind the scenes to protect both the judges and the institution's credibility? Well, that's where things get even more surreal. When even the Supreme Court starts adjusting its behavior out of fear, you know the stakes have reached an entirely new level. The Supreme Court just banged the gavel in Trump's favor, giving him the kind of power he's probably been daydreaming about since his "you're fired" days. Thanks to a fresh ruling, the court now lets the president fire the heads of independent agencies. Keyword independent, without any cause. This move is a massive win for something called the Unitary executive theory, which is just a fancy way of saying they think the president should have absolute control over every part of the executive branch. Picture Trump being able to boot agency heads with the same whim he applies to shuffling golf caddies. But here's where it gets strange. There's one glaring exception in this new power play: the Federal Reserve. Let's pause for a second and take this apart. The court essentially decided that Trump or any president could walk into the offices of, say, the Environmental Protection Agency or the Federal Trade Commission and say, "Pack your Rolodex, you're out." No reason needed, no accountability check. And this isn't just a hypothetical. If Trump's back in office, don't be surprised if he clears house faster than a post-election White House staff. But in an absolutely bizarre twist, the court has decided the Federal Reserve of all agencies is safe from this freewheeling game of musical chairs. Why? Well, according to the court, the Fed is special due to something called a distinct historical tradition. Sounds official, right? Critics, though, think it's more like saying, "because we said so." Justice Elena Kagan, never one to mince words when it comes to bad logic, came in with a dissent that could only be described as scathing. She essentially accused the court of pulling this reasoning out of thin air, or worse, outright hypocrisy. Under the principle the court just used, she suggested, there's no way of actually distinguishing the Fed from any other agency. In plain English, Kagan's saying that their logic doesn't hold water, and honestly, it feels like a loophole made on the spot. She didn't just disagree, she flat out shredded their reasoning, mocking the court's attempt to cherry pick when certain rules should apply. It's the judicial version of calling out someone who changes the rules mid-game to make sure they win. Now, if you're wondering what kind of history they're referring to, well, welcome to the gray area. Apparently, the court feels the Federal Reserve's role in managing the economy makes it too important to toy with, especially during turbulent times. And if you're thinking this explanation sounds suspiciously convenient, you're not alone. Critics argue that this historical tradition defense is the same kind of justification the court has recently used to make sweeping changes in other areas, like gun control laws. In other words, it's a go-to excuse for when the court wants to do whatever fits their agenda that day. But let's zoom out for a second. Why does this ruling matter beyond legal jargon? For one, it shifts power dramatically in favor of the president. Independent agencies were designed to, well, stay independent, free from political influence, focused on upholding things like environmental standards, fair business practices, and consumer protections. Stripping away their independence could turn them into extensions of a president's political team. And if that president is someone like Trump, who famously values loyalty above all else, you're looking at agencies that are all but certain to prioritize politics over their actual missions. This brings us back to the Federal Reserve. The court's decision to protect the Fed sticks out like a sore thumb. It's like declaring one seat at a wrecking ball demolition party as off limits while flattening everything else. Speculation points to a simple reason: fear. Letting Trump or any president interfere with the Fed could wreak havoc on the economy. Think of Trump's previous clashes with Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, over interest rates. Now imagine Trump being handed the legal ability to fire Powell or any future chairperson just for not playing ball with his political or economic narrative. The ripple effects would be catastrophic, and the court appears keenly aware of this possibility. But let's not kid ourselves. The decision to single out the Fed isn't about some lofty principle. If anything, it highlights how deep the fear runs. In this case, fear of economic fallout seems to have outweighed a commitment to consistent legal logic. Critics are already pointing out that this kind of exception sets a dangerous precedent. If a president can't touch the Fed because the court's afraid of the consequences, does that mean other institutions now depend on whether the bench values their role enough to save them? It creates a slippery slope where legal protections feel more like lucky breaks than rights grounded in law. So here we are. The Supreme Court handed Trump a political Swiss Army knife by giving him unchecked power over nearly every independent agency, except for the one they're too nervous to let him tinker with. This isn't about principles or even precedent. It's about fear. Fear of economic chaos, sure, but maybe even fear of what happens when this much power is handed to someone who's already shown how recklessly he's willing to use it. But that fear cuts both ways. While the Fed might be untouchable, the court seems to be actively crafting special rules for situations that terrify them. It begs the question, what happens when crafting rules for survival starts looking a lot like avoiding accountability? Speaking of accountability, there's one issue the Supreme Court seems too scared to touch, and this one involves Trump directly. Let's talk about how they're dodging the big constitutional question everyone's asking. Forget the Constitution, because the Supreme Court just handed Congress a massive get-out-of-jail-free card for Trump. In a unanimous decision, the justices ruled that states can't use the 14th Amendment's disqualification clause to keep federal candidates like Trump off the ballot. Instead, they shifted the responsibility to Congress, which, let's face it, is about as likely to act decisively as a sloth in a foot race. This move didn't just overturn Colorado's attempt to remove Trump from their 2024 ballots. It opened a door so wide you could drive his entire motorcade through it. And what's sitting on the other side of that door? A constitutional loophole big enough to swallow the idea of accountability. This all started when challengers in Colorado cited Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bars anyone who engaged in insurrection from holding office, and pointed directly at Trump's actions during and leading up to January 6th. It's pretty straightforward. If you wage war on democracy, you don't get to run it. Seems logical, right? But the Supreme Court decided to punt instead of play, focusing not on whether Trump's actions met the bar for insurrection, but on whether states like Colorado have the authority to enforce the clause at all. Spoiler alert, the court said no. Only Congress can enforce the 14th Amendment against federal candidates, leaving the ultimate decision in the hands of the very body made up of people who, for the most part, depend on Trump's voter base to keep their jobs. If you're wondering how we got from obvious constitutional disqualification to, may let Congress handle it, the court's reasoning is as vague as it is frustrating. Their opinion didn't rule on whether Trump's behavior violated the 14th Amendment, sidestepped the debate about whether January 6th was an insurrection, and avoided determining whether the amendment's applicability is self-executing. Instead, they planted the whole mess on Congress's lap, where no one expects anything productive to happen. This tactical dodge means Congress would have to pass explicit legislation enforcing Section 3, which isn't just unlikely, it's politically toxic in the current climate. So congratulations, the justices found a way to stay neutral while giving Trump a constitutional freebie. Take Colorado as a prime example of how this ruling plays out on the ground. When election officials attempted to keep Trump off the state's ballot for his role in the Capitol attack, it seemed bold but not impossible. After all, the language of the 14th Amendment is clear. If you took an oath to support the Constitution but then became an insurrectionist, you're barred from office. Seems direct enough to cut through legal squabbling, right? But nope. The Supreme Court just nixed that entirely, forcing Colorado and every other state to back off and leaving the decision squarely in the hands of lawmakers who haven't exactly been paragons of bold action lately. The implications of this are massive. By ruling that no state has the power to enforce the clause, Trump essentially gets a guaranteed spot on the ballot, all ballots, regardless of his actions or how bad they were. How likely is it that Congress will step in? Let's not kid ourselves. With the GOP still rallying enthusiastically behind Trump and the Democratic majority barely holding things together, expecting Congress to take a stand against him is like expecting him to go vegan. Not a chance. All of this sets a precedent that rewrites what accountability means in US politics. It's a dangerous signal to future candidates. Act however you want. If Congress doesn't act, you're untouchable. Legal experts are already ripping this ruling apart, and not just because they disagree with the outcome. Some critics argue that the court's decision undermines the very design of the Reconstruction Amendments, which were supposed to create self-enforcing rules to protect democracy after the Civil War. Saying Congress must legislate enforcement for the 14th Amendment's disqualification clause is essentially choosing bureaucracy over principle. It gives Congress an automatic veto over whether the Constitution even applies, a veto everyone knows they'll never actually use. Others point to the dangerous precedent this sets. If Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is treated as toothless, what's stopping future presidents or candidates from even worse behavior? The court has effectively created a special rule for insurrection-related disqualifications, making it harder than ever to uphold this part of the Constitution. Justice may be blind, but right now, it also feels conveniently selective. So why did the court dodge the elephant in the room? Trump's actual eligibility. The theory floating around is this: legitimacy. The Supreme Court knows its reputation is already in rough shape after a string of controversial decisions that have polarized the public. A ruling directly saying Trump does or doesn't qualify under the 14th Amendment would be explosive. They don't want the protests on their doorsteps or the cable news circus. By sidestepping the issue entirely, they get to avoid the fallout while looking like they're deferring to Congress out of respect for the separation of powers. In reality, though, it doesn't take a constitutional scholar to see what's really happening. The court is kicking the decision to Congress, fully aware that it won't do anything. It's a way to appear principled while washing their hands of the issue. But can an action like this really protect the court's legitimacy? Or does it just make them look like they're shirking the responsibility they're supposed to embody as the ultimate arbiter of the law? Think about it. They didn't rule Trump eligible. They didn't rule him ineligible. They just avoided. And in that avoidance, they created a loophole that Trump or anyone like him can easily exploit. What's more terrifying is the precedent. If accountability under the 14th Amendment can be hand-waved away, what other constitutional safeguards are at risk? With all these dodges, loopholes, and special rules, it's worth asking, what's really going on in the minds of the justices? Are they protecting Trump, protecting themselves, or protecting their institution from collapse? Whichever theory you buy, one thing seems clear: fear is a bigger influence on the court right now than any constitutional principle. And if the highest court in the land is this rattled, what does that tell us about the state of American democracy? The Supreme Court isn't just reacting to Trump, they're reacting to what his chaos has unleashed. When Chief Justice John Roberts, a man famous for hiding behind neutrality, starts pushing back publicly, that's a flashing warning light. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson didn't sugarcoat it either. Attacks on judges are attacks on democracy itself. These aren't just political games anymore. If the highest court in the land feels cornered, what are the rest of us supposed to make of this? It's clear, the judiciary's independence hangs by a thread. Protecting it isn't optional. It's the only way to safeguard democracy's future.